女士们、先生们，下面我们把目光转向全球金融走向，寻求稳定国际金融秩序和重建融资市场信心。Now, let's turn our attention to securing the future of global finance. How can trust be restored? Is more regulation required? 本章节将由亚太经合组织秘书处执行主任博拉尔德主持。This session will be hosted by Alan Bullard, Executive Director of APEC Secretariat. 参加这部分峰会讨论的嘉宾有 Now I'm honored to invite 新西兰总理约翰基 His Excellency John Key, Prime Minister of New Zealand 美洲开发银行行长路易斯·莫雷诺 Luis Moreno, President of the Inter-American Development Bank 友邦保险集团首席执行官兼总裁杜嘉琪 Mark Tucker, Group CEO and President of AIA 建设银行董事长王鸿章 Wang Hongzhang, Chairman of the Construction Bank of China 现在请大家起立以热烈的掌声欢迎他们的到来 Now please rise and applaud for their arrival. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seat. And Mr. Alan Bullard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, and welcome everybody to this session of the CEO Summit Dialogue on Global Finance. Everybody in this room knows that you don't get economic growth without a well-functioning financial sector. But I'm afraid everybody in this room also knows that a financial sector with excesses can be a dangerous one as well. This session is going to explore the future of global finance. We're going to ask, is the global financial system vulnerable? How can trust be restored? Are necessary reforms in place? Is more regulation required? And what other insights can we find from this? And to answer these questions for you, we've got a very strong panel this morning, which I'll be very pleased to introduce in turn. The panelists will each speak for a time, then we'll take some clusters of questions from the floor and come back to the panel. We're interested in provoking an interesting, insightful discussion where we can get to some interesting points. Well, it's my very big pleasure, first of all, to introduce the Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Right Honourable John Key. He's had a very long and distinguished career actually in finance and banking before he decided to also make the switch into politics. And in 2008, it was the very middle of the financial sector crisis. We were both there at the time, so we're nodding knowingly. He became Prime Minister of New Zealand. There's probably better times to take on that position, but he's been very successful in there, and proof of that is that last month he won a rare third term in office as Prime Minister. Prime Minister Key, over to you. Thank you.
Alan, firstly, can I just acknowledge you? Alan, as you may know in the room, was Reserve Bank Governor in New Zealand, as you mentioned, when I first became Prime Minister in 2008, now APEC Secretariat. Can I acknowledge my fellow members of the panel? One of the questions that's been posed to me is there vulnerability in the global financial system? And I think the answer to that is strikingly obvious, which is there is always the potential for vulnerability in the global financial system. I think there's always that potential for a variety of reasons, but the first of them is just the interrelationship and the connectivity of the global financial sector. And that's really what we saw with the global financial crisis, that capital knows no boundaries, it flows around the world and it flows to where opportunities are. And because it flows so freely these days, I think the big risk actually for us in one area is that that free flow of capital creates bubbles. So to a certain degree you can identify that in the US system when the global financial crisis came. It in part was the nature of the products that were created, subprime mortgages, which were inherently unstable actually and ill-conceived in their concept, but it was actually the underlying asset that they promoted, which was an overinflated housing market in the United States. So it was the two together. So firstly, I think the view is that, my view certainly would be that the global financial system always has that capacity to be vulnerable. The second thing I'd say is that the risk is varying depending on the nature of the providers. So in New Zealand we have a very strong banking sector and an increasingly stronger non-banking sector, and those two now live sort of happily together, and as a result of the global financial crisis there are a significant number of changes in the non-banking sector. That's certainly where New Zealand experienced losses and defaults. It wasn't in the banking sector, it was in the non-banking sector, and in fact there are a number of changes that I'll talk about in a moment. But again, I think one of the really interesting things that will change around the world is what role the internet plays in the provision of financial services. So if you take Alibaba as a good example, seeing we're here in China, as you probably know, as an online trading platform, Alibaba is extremely significant. So its turnover these days is larger than eBay and Amazon combined. I think its ambition within a few years is to be larger in turnover terms than Walmart. It's pretty natural, I think, that you will start seeing these sorts of platforms being the kind of place that financial services will also be provided to support the underlying commerce and ultimately to open up new opportunities. So ultimately, whether it's an Alibaba or a financial platform that comes from one of the established providers, you are going to see the internet really opening up those opportunities. Second thing I'd say about the vulnerability is it sits into two categories. One is leverage and the second part is liquidity. So what's happening in terms of leverage is that leverage is the real area where that vulnerability is exposed, because in terms of investments around the world, it's one thing to have an investor putting money in what we would call a real money fund, but backing up absolutely the underlying investments. Quite a different issue once you have leverage taking place, and we can see the growth in those leverage funds around the world, and increasingly leverage is being moved out of the traditional financial institutions because they are much more heavily regulated, moving into fund managers and the likes, and I think that does create some vulnerability in the kind of world financial system. And what we know is once you put together high degree of leverage, mobility of capital, then inevitably you get liquidity issues as people try and exit markets that are not performing well. From New Zealand's point of view, our banking system's strong. So the World Economic Forum just ranked us as the second most sound banking system. As I said earlier, in the banking sector there were no failures, but in the non-bank system after the global financial crisis there were, and that led to two changes in New Zealand. The first was the establishment of a single regulator, the Financial Markets Authority, and the second thing was a much greater role in supervision of the non-bank sector from the Reserve Bank. I think the question around financial stability is whose responsibility is it? Well, in the first instance, clearly it's the government, but I think it actually stems further than that. I think it's a huge responsibility of the institutions themselves and actually of the investors. And if you look at what happened as a result of the global financial crisis and the collapse of a number of the very significant investment banks, in the first instance, it's clearly was the responsibility of the regulators to make sure that they didn't put themselves in the position they did. But it was also true that the investors, if they were really understanding those risks, would have put much more pressure on the institution. So one of the things we've tried to do with our regulation in New Zealand is to make sure actually that there's far better understanding at a retail level of the risks and the leverage that those institutions have. Second thing we try to focus a lot more on is the intercompany lending and the exposures that are created as a result of that. Probably surprisingly for a politician, but maybe less so because of my background, I don't actually think the answer's in more regulation. I think it's in better regulation and flexible regulation. Actually, there are a number of countries around the world where you can point to a significant build-up in the level of regulation, and all that's doing is forcing financial institutions either to relocate to another jurisdiction where the regulation is not as tight, or secondly to move it out of the regulated part of their sector. So in my view, we need to actually drive that better regulation. Just lastly, in terms of APEC and its role, if you think about APEC in the 25 years it's been in existence, APEC's been a big driver in terms of economic performance. So if we were at this conference talking about the capacity to trade, the capacity to drill in behind the border regulation, our ability to grow each other's markets, then APEC's been, I think, a staggering success. And we have the potential from the forum of APEC to drive much greater trading relationships. We're seeing that with TPP, we're seeing that with RCEP as a concept, and we're seeing that with FTAP. The real issue, I think, around the financial part of APEC is that in the first instance, we tend to think of APEC as trade and to a certain degree as investment. But what you are increasingly also seeing is financial integration in the region. From New Zealand's point of view, to give you an idea of how significant that is, 3/4 of all of our exports are into APEC countries. So the 21 countries in the economy of APEC represent the bulk of where New Zealand's economic activity is being undertaken. And what you're seeing in a place like New Zealand is that level of financial deregulation and the increasing role that those lenders in the region are taking is reflected in the makeup of what's happening in New Zealand. So, for instance, if you look at some of the major Chinese banks, ICBC, Construction Bank of China and the likes, they are establishing themselves in New Zealand, and they're starting to take a much more interested profile in some of the very big financing opportunities, particularly around public-private partnerships and the other consortiums that we see in New Zealand. And in our core agricultural sector where New Zealand has great strength, Rabobank has been one of the big international lenders really starting to lift its activity. So my view is, yes, there's vulnerability in the system. Yes, we need to understand how to manage and control that better. Yes, we need regulation, but we need the right type of regulation. And I think finally we do need to work on making sure as we expand the trading and investment profile of countries in APEC, we also need to think about the financial integration.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. It's my pleasure to now introduce our second panellist. He's Mr. Luis Moreno. He is from Colombia. He is president of the Inter-American Development Bank. The Inter-American Development Bank is headquartered in Washington. It has 48 member countries, and it's got ordinary capital of US 100.
To, in essence, begin to construct more confidence, because what he was describing is perhaps the gaps that exist in a world where we are so much more interconnected, that perhaps what's really needed is ways to help converge regulation in ways that we can reduce volatility, and more importantly, as he correctly said, the answer is not more regulation, but smarter regulation that can help begin to build confidence. We know that confidence is a big gap in the system. Confidence is not something that you decree, it's something that you construct over time. And I say this because I come from a region that in a space of 25 years, we had over 30 financial crises. These last few ones didn't really start in Latin America, many others did. And so in that regard, we learned the hard way. And what we learned was that it is fundamental for a certain set of things to happen. Certainly to begin to correct macroeconomic imbalances. We went from times where we had triple-digit inflation to single-digit inflation today. Also to strengthen and to have smart regulation and supervision. And the whole question of risk to asset ratios, because the element of risk is increasingly a very important part of the discussion on regulation. One of the more interesting things when the financial crisis hit is how Latin American economies were actually very well prepared, not only from the fiscal side for governments to use counter-cyclical policies to prevent economies from coming down, but more importantly, the kind of regulation that was already in place that helped banks not entering the kinds of adventurous kind of projects that others did. And of course, another element is how you develop domestic markets and domestic debt markets. A lot of talk has been here around infrastructure. When you think back and say, what are the elements that prevent more buildup of infrastructure? It's really because of issues of risk. Risk to the sponsors, risk in long-term financing, for instance, in local currency, risk associated with the kinds of feasibility studies, environmental impact studies. These are the kinds of things that in a holistic way need to be taken care of. And that's kind of the work that we do, and most development banks are tasked to do, which has to do fundamentally to help bring to market, be it on public-private partnerships or by government-sponsored type projects, the kind of infrastructure build-up that we need. And in this regard, when one looks at Latin America, our current investment in infrastructure is, roughly speaking, about 2.5% of GDP. We must double that in the next 20 years if we're simply to remain competitive. And this, of course, provides for a huge opportunity for Asian investors to come into a region that has huge potential. The other part that we did was basically how to reduce financial dollarization that we had in the past. This was, of course, part of the way that we had a lot of the financing was short-term dollar-denominated kind of financing. Today there's long tenors, yield curves were established in local currency, and this basically provided a lot of security to the markets. And over time, what we have seen is how governments have been able to accumulate an important amount of reserves to the tune of close to $840 billion, which is what Latin America and the Caribbean has as a whole. So with kind of the change in the business cycle that we have today, without the kinds of tailwinds that we had in the past, with high commodity prices, with low interest rates, with big Chinese demand, and certainly China growing at double-digit rates, we realize today that a lot of the growth is going to come from our own internal engines. And that means that countries need to focus more on structural reforms, which is a large part of the work that we do to help countries do the set of structural reforms and the sequencing of them to get the impact. And we all know, of course, that those structural reforms take time to have effects, but you see countries like Mexico today, like Peru and others, who have been able, and Chile, who have been able to do some of these reforms, and this is why one can explain the levels of growth that they're having, which are basically ahead of their peers. So in a nutshell, I think, going back to what the Prime Minister was saying, this whole issue of confidence is something that will take time, that will require a growing convergence. I know that the Financial Stability Forum in the margins of the G20 has done some things, but we got to do far more, and we got to do this in a regional way and begin to find those convergences. Because at the end of the day, The other element that is driving the lack of confidence is something that has been talked a lot about in this forum as well, and that's the issue of inequality. Inequality breeds a sense of lack of trust, and that's the other area that we need to focus on a lot. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, President. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our third panellist. Mark Tucker started life as a professional footballer, but here he is today. He's Group CEO and President of the AIA Group. The AIA Group is the largest independent, publicly listed Pan-Asian life insurance group, total assets of $159 billion US, operates in 17 markets in Asia and Pacific. And incidentally, Mark was on the court of the Bank of England, the board of the Bank of England, for much of the hard times during the financial crisis as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. I think consistent with both the Prime Minister and Lewis, I think my view is that the financial system today does remain vulnerable. And I think that's been exacerbated because of the potential effects of the cure of the last crisis. And more of that rather than any inherent flaws in the system itself. What I'd like to do is maybe just move to the side and just give a sense of one area which I think is fundamental but not spoken about much, and that's the whole area of trust, because I believe that's the foundation for real progress to be made. It's clear that financial services and regulators do share common ground, and that common ground is the economic health of societies, and that common ground is really the foundation for trust. But what we've seen, and I think is common in many parts of the world, is that there is little and sometimes no recognition of that common ground. And indeed, in many places, there's political pressure on both regulators and financial services to deny that it actually exists. The costs to societies of the current situation, I think, are considerable, and they're rising. And they contribute significantly to both fiscal pressures and government borrowing. So to my mind, trust is not a nice to have, but a necessity. Distrust and mistrust lead to high cost on both sides and to the context in which they operate. I think trust can be restored by moving to address a number of issues, 3 key issues. First, the protection of retail savings. Second, the better coordination of risk-based capital or RBC regimes. And third is the eventual absorption by the real economy of the extraordinary liquidity injections by the central banks that we've seen in the aftermath of the GFC. On the retail protection side, just to make 2 quick points. First is really to do no harm. Regulatory systems and monetary policy makers need to take into account the role of proactive and need to be proactive supporters of the need of households to make effective provision for retirement, for rainy day needs. And they need to see, in a sense, the build-up of private savings has a major impact in reducing the contingent liabilities for governments in particular ageing societies. And getting both parties to think and work in this way is critical. Second, and certainly in my own industry, life insurance and pension funds pool retail savings and really serve as the ideal basis, the ideal source of long-term investment capital. The liabilities are long-term, and therefore the assets to match those are long-term, and therefore to encourage the industries to be able to invest long-term is absolutely key. We are patient in terms of capital. We are patient capital holders. We have much longer horizons than particular banks or other financial organizations, and I think factoring that, I think, is another important element. My second general point is on really RBC regimes, the risk-based capital, which are an important component in any sound regulatory structure. But the important thing to bear in mind here is that regulation is only optimized if it's proportionate to need. And optimization, not overkill, in our view, must be the aim. And to a degree, and something the Prime Minister said before, the notion that global financial system will be strengthened by the wholesale global application of regulatory standards devised by the major advanced economies of the world is potentially flawed and, in my view, fundamentally dangerous. And I think we've got some very good models locally in Asia for RBC in places like Singapore, in Thailand, and of course New Zealand. And I think to build and coordinate the models locally is critical. The current emphasis on regulation is leading to a risk of what a former Deputy Central Bank Governor recently called reckless prudence. He said we are so risk averse that we are requiring levels of capital that are probably beyond what is sensible and intrusive supervision which is not really sustainable. And indeed what we've seen a very sharp swing of the pendulum post-GFC for the financial system as a whole. Pre-crisis, politicians were talking about not getting in the way of the financial sector, which was seen as an enormous wealth generator. But then that has now switched to language that is all about intrusive supervision and much more directed to control by regulators. It's inevitable, and it's an inevitable consequence of a crisis that this would happen. But again, we view the pendulum has swung too far back. And getting now supervisors and firms to try and move the pendulum to a sustainable position is key. And this requires different regulation, and I say again, as the Prime Minister and Lewis said, not more regulation, but different regulation that acknowledges and that regulators and financial services share responsibility for the economic health of societies and taking the basis at a higher level. My third point is really around the preparing for the unintended consequences of the liquidity injections. QE did intentionally create low return on so-called safe assets, which forced all savers, but particularly retail savers, into riskier assets, inflating asset prices at the same time. At some point, this has to end. At some point, there will have to be a convergence of economic fundamentals and asset prices, either by having economic fundamentals rise or asset prices fall, or a combination thereof. And during this process, I think retail savers remain substantially at risk. So in summary, and just to end, I think the focus should be on protecting retail investors through needs-based and proportionate regulation, not global uniformity, and optimizing development of the capital markets in order to really promote long-term economic development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tucker. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our fourth member of the panel. Wang Hongxiang is chairman of China Construction Bank. As you all know, it's a very major global bank, traditionally in infrastructure loans and residential mortgages, but right across the space of retail, wholesale lending, investment, wealth management services and other products. Total assets of RMB 16.4 trillion. Yes, that was trillion. Thank you, Chairman.
非常感谢。这个大家讨论全球金融的时候，可能会马上想到2007年的这个次贷危机，以及引发到目前的世界金融危机。直到现在呢，有些问题还没有完全解决。那么应该吸取的就是我们在从中应该有哪些教训，和哪些经验。当然，从次贷危机到现在，在国际金融监管上，包括国际金融的创新上，我们有哪些教训和经验？应该说还没有一个完整的一个经验来供大家分享。但是有一点大家讨论最多的就是国际金融危机出现的时候，是创新过度还是监管不足？这个大家议论都比较多。但真正解决这个问题，还需要各国的监管者和各个国家和地区的金融实体、金融业和商业银行来自己来正确的面对这个问题。正因为由此，所以中国的金融业从2005年 特别是银行业进行了脱胎换骨的改革。应该说，经过将近10年的改革，中国的金融业整体上应该说是比较健康。刚才主持人讲说，建设银行我们资产总额已经到了16.4万亿，那么还有一些很好的数字，比如说我们的利润总额，这个一年可以到2000多亿元人民币。ILE 和 ILA 的这个指标也居于国际大银行的前列。但是应该实事求是讲，作为中国的这几家大银行公司中建交，在规模上，在盈利的总量上，包括在一些主要指标上，和国际大银行可以相比拟。但是实事求是讲，我们距离国际化的水平和能够具备国际化的经验还相差很远，所以有必要进行改革，进行进一步的创新。那么在创新过程当中，又碰到另外一个问题，就是我们创新呢，如何能够在创新当中规避金融的风险。这个最近10几年，中国银行业的创新应该说走在了这个其他行业的前面。现在中国银行业的产品、工具，包括为客户服务的机制和体制，应该说是非常健全，适应了中国的经济和中国的客户，无论是对公客户还是个人客户各方面的资金需求。我就举一个例子，比如说我们现在中国银行业的账务性交易80%以上是电子交易，这在10年之前是不可想象的。但是又碰到另外一个问题，在创新的时候，如何规避更多的风险？大家也知道，现在大家议论也比较多的，就中国的影子银行。中国的影子银行，应该说，从总体上，我们感觉到不会对中国的金融体系造成冲击。当然，中国影子银行的数量现在有不同的说法，有的说10几万亿，有的说不到9万亿。无论是10几万亿也好，还是9万亿也好，面对中国的150-60万亿的银行业资产和金融业资产来讲，它占的比例是不高，占的比例并不高，所以不会对中国的金融体系造成什么影响。第二点呢，这些因为创新出现的影子银行，从2013年开始，中国的监管部门已经对所有的影子银行的业务都实施了有效的监管，制定了各种的监管指标，应该说总体上呢是比较稳定的。但是并不意味着中国银行业的体系非常健全、非常规范，和国际大银行相比，我们还有很多不足的地方。那么解决这个问题，采取的最主要的措施和最首要的方式，应该是适应中国企业走出去的需要。在中国企业走向世界的时候，中国的银行业、中国的金融业也应该走向世界。所以最近10几年，中国银行业走向世界的步伐在加快。那么只有走向世界以后，才能检验中国的银行业的金融体系是不是符合国际规则，是不是能够在经营上和管理上能够满足投资者的需要，满足客户的需要。只有走出去，才能鉴别真伪。最近几年，我们在走出去当中，这个中国的银行业取得了很好的成果。应该说，在目前世界的5大洲，包括这个很多的主要的国家和地区，都有中国银行业的机构。但是我们的服务的范围和过去比，这个也有了很大的改进。当然也有不足，比如说改进的方面，就是我们海外机构的营业的规模和营业的质量，应该说是很不错。但是我们服务的范围和服务的对象还存在一些不足，比如说主要是为中国的企业走出去提供良好的服务，但是为当地的客户、为当地的经济、为当地的无论是对公客户和个人客户的服务，这方面还有很多方面的欠缺。那么在走出去当中，我们遇到另外一个问题，就监管的问题。我觉得在国际上的金融业的监管的均衡性和透明度还应该有进一步的提升。所以这次 APEC 和一个最主要的议题的亚太自贸区， 建设，包括互联互通。实质是这个自贸区的建设也好，和互联互通也好，那么在银行的支持上也应该有一个统一的标准、统一的规则，这样来讲呢，可以使这个互联互通啊更加顺畅。因为金融毕竟是经济的一个连接器和晴雨表，如果金融能够做到互联互通，金融能够做到自由化，监管能够做到均衡，监管的透明度如果更高，可能对国际经济贸易、对国际金融的稳健性可能会起到非常好的作用。谢谢大家。
Well, thank you to all of our panellists for their introductory remarks. It's time to open this up now to the floor, and we're open to questions from the floor. Can I ask you please to wait for the microphone, to stand and tell us where you're from, and then to keep questions brief so that we can handle a number of discussions. I can see one hand waving on that side. Thank you. Yes, microphone there.
Thank you very much. My name is Sandu. I'm the president of MSP Drillix, one of the oil and gas manufacturer in China. My question goes to Prime Minister Qi and also the Chairman Wang. As a Chinese manufacturer, especially of relatively small and medium size, although we are focusing in the energy sector, we try to start our globalization and localization strategy. We found that investing in New Zealand, especially after my team has done some homework, which is quite difficult in the sense that to understand the local policies, especially regarding with registration and tax, and also the human resources issues, we found that quite difficult. So my question to the Prime Minister is that for a high-tech Chinese medium-sized company to go to invest in New Zealand's energy sector, what's your view and what's your attitude and what we can do? And to Chairman Wang, of course, again, for a high-tech manufacturer, we are one of the few subsea oil and gas equipment producer in China. How we can benefit from the recent policy issued by the central government to encourage the high-tech Chinese companies to go abroad. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Can I urge you to keep questions briefer, please? Not a time to advertise your company. Thank you. Next questions. Any further questions? We'll take a few. I think a woman wearing a white jacket there. Thank you. We'll take a few questions and then we'll come back to the panel. No, sorry, it's the woman wearing the white jacket there. Thank you.
Sorry. Good morning. My question goes to President Wang, Chairman Wang. Currently, a lot of banks have...
Excuse me, madam, where are you from, please?
I'm from the youth delegate of the APEC program. I'm from China. And my question is that a lot of banks, together with Trust Corporation and as well as some found subsidiaries, have issued some non-standard financial products to circumvent the Basel Capital Accord, so which have generated a lot of risks. So, what kind of regulations or prudential supervisions can we do for the government or from the bank sectors to help this kind of situation? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yes, we'll go to next door to you there.
喂，你好，我是来自中国林鼎的李子策。 啊。我们呢主要在从事呢一些新技术交易，其中一项呢最重要的一个成果呢，就是我们在这个反恐和防暴领域里面呢，我们用于公共安全和军警用的这个车辆上面的这个防暴技术，那包括呢这次这个 APEC 的一些技术保障啊，然后我们在一些这个热点地区，比如像伊拉克、阿富汗，那简单点说呢，就基本上是这个美国政府去的地方呢，我们也都去啊，所以呢，这个技术呢，这个是我们的一个重要的一个内容。还有呢，我们在做了一些这个奢侈品方面的一个源头的一个技术保障。那么我们在欧洲呢，在意大利呢，我们收购了这个一家呢在皮料方面制作技术很好的这个公司啊。那这项技术的话呢，主要是用来把我们的这个所有的奢侈品的这个皮质的产品做的质量更高啊，去除它的一些相应的油脂和它的水分的就是这个来确保它的质量啊。那我想问的问题呢，就是说在技术方面是不是能够我们有我们的王行长在，那我们的基本账号也在建设银行啊，还有呢我知道呢就是友邦保险呢这个我们的总裁也在。那我们呢，有很多时候呢，尤其在涉及到安全领域里的技术呢，我们希望是不是友邦保险公司的话呢，愿意去做这样的一个保险啊？还有一项呢，就是我们希望呢，就是这种基金是不是我们的自己的银行在支持自己的企业走出去的时候，能够成立一家适合的基金，那支持更多的企业呢走出去。好，谢谢。
Thank you. We'll take one more question, then we'll go to the panel. Yes, Madam, can you stand up with your hand up so the microphone can see you, please? Yes.
Darryl Guppy, Australia-China Business Council. I have some questions in relation to the process of capital allocation, because that's the key for regulation. Is the allocation of capital via secondary markets through stock exchanges still the most effective process in the post-GFC environment? And I'm thinking particularly the impact of high-frequency trading and exchange-traded funds. Or, on the other hand, if we transfer capital allocation to the banking and shadow banking sectors in the systems, then what differences in regulations are required in this less transparent capital environment? And finally, of course, if we go forward and look at the growing use of the coffee cloud environment of crowdfunding, then how do we ensure appropriate transparency in that and the risk management in a more fluid and fast-moving environment? Sacha.
Thank you. We've had 4 questions. Who would like to pick up on those? Prime Minister Key, would you like to start?
Let me just start, I guess, with the first, which was from the energy sector in terms of investment in New Zealand. What I'd say is, firstly, we welcome foreign investment in New Zealand. If you look at all of the international surveys around competitiveness and openness of the economy, we rank extremely highly. So you mentioned there were 1 or 2 issues. Obviously, every company is different, but generally, if you invest in New Zealand, well, depending on the thresholds, you're always subject to what's called the Overseas Investment Act, and that controls investment through a process administered by the Overseas Investment Office. We accept, actually, it can be a complicated process sometimes, but I guess, ultimately, if you're going to welcome capital in, then you have to be, confident about what's happening and where it's going. In terms of the energy sector in general in New Zealand, our view is that we're lucky in that we're extremely renewable in New Zealand. 75% of all energy in New Zealand comes from the renewable sector, primarily hydro, but in recent times geothermal and wind. Solar plays some part, but it's much smaller, but over time we're looking to reach our target of 90% renewable by 2025. And so as a kind of overarching comment, what I'd say is yes, we'd welcome you in New Zealand. Hopefully we can work through any of the specific issues you have. Obviously won't go across every question, but the only one point I'd make is just in terms of the company that came from China, talking about new technology in relation to anti-terrorism. I'm not sure you have an answer to your question, but I just simply make a point, I suppose, which is if you look at vulnerability around the world financial sector, then and you would ask what are the things that could have a reasonably big impact on financial stability. Obviously, it's the underlying fundamentals of the system and the leverage in the system and excesses that grow in the system. But I do think the risk of terrorism and the impact that that's currently playing out with ISIL is very, very significant. I think that if you look in the Middle East at the moment, you've now got a situation where ISIL has declared a caliphate in the region. That means that they are fundamentally going to ignore all territorial boundaries. That means that they want to have control of arguably one of the most volatile parts of the world, the home of at least a lot of the oil of the world, and at the core of it, terrorist activities have the capacity to sap the market of confidence, and how you combat that is going to require a range of different initiatives that countries are thinking through, but in so much that we can use technology to at least inform us and reduce that risk, and that's to be welcomed.
Thank you. Chairman Wang, would you like to pick up on any of the questions?
好，谢谢。刚才4个来宾提了问题，实质是2个问题。第1个和第3个提的问题相似，第2个和第4个来宾提的问题相似。所以1、3这2个问题啊，实质是涉及到中国的企业如何走出去，特别是中国的小微企业和民营企业。在金融政策上，如何提供更好的服务？首先呢，应该说，民营企业和小微企业，到世界上是发展，应该说是有很好的基础和条件。国内的政策，我觉得现在很多已经得到了很好的贯彻和落实，其实你们可以得到很好的利用。比如说高科技企业，在发展过程当中，可能不仅仅需要银行的贷款，可能更多的需要基金、信托，包括高科技的风险投资，来注入到高科技产业。因为高科技产业呢，对资本的回报要求是比较高的，同时风险度也比较高。所以我倒建议你，如果支持你们发展的话，你不妨多试行一下这种基金、信托，包括高科技的风险投资，通过这个来解决资金不足问题。当然也可以需要银行贷款，但银行贷款都有严格的控制风险的条件和标准。从支持企业走出去这个角度呢，我觉得银行也应该支持。但是可能要进行严格的评估。第2个呢，关于走出去的方式，现在大家都知道，上海的自贸区建设，为在自贸区内的企业，无论是走出去还是在自贸区内的企业走进到国内来，有很好的政策，所以可以充分利用这个政策呢，走到外面去。包括第1个来宾讲到的，在新西兰建个企业。那么我高兴地告诉你，本月就是这个月，我们建设银行的新西兰子行，在新西兰总理的亲自关照下，马上就要开业。如果你在新西兰设厂的话，也不一定找国内的建设银行，可以到建设银行的新西兰子行去申请贷款。第2个问题呢，讲到了我们公司。你们的公司和基金、信托合作的时候，风险怎么来把控？应该说，现在中国投资的机会比较多，不仅仅是信托基金，还有其他的类似影子银行这样的。当然，你们也讲到了，配置到这些方面呢，可能会有一些风险，但这个风险恐怕需要我们投资者自己来把控。但是有一点，无论是什么样的金融企业，它不在于你哪个行业有风险，关键问题你选择的投资的方式 和你选择的基金、信托、商业银行，包括其他的类似影子银行这样的公司，你选择的是不是准确？我也希望呢，我们所有的投资者在中国投资的这些影子银行，能够都得到安全的运营和安全的保障。谢谢。
Thank you. Any of the other panelists wish to make any points?
Perhaps just one point. I think on the again on the anti-terrorism piece, I sit on the board of a bank as well as an insurance company, and therefore, in terms of the investment that I know goes into from banks and insurance companies into protecting customer bases on the IT side, it's significant. And again, as an example, we have close to 50 million customers, so ensuring that their data is kept confidential and private, we spend a vast amount of time. Attacks on the system happen every day, all day. It's not uncommon within financial services for 3 to 4 attacks per second every day, every hour of the year. So you're talking literally billions of attacks a year on the system, and therefore to do that, the element of security has to be sophisticated. The elements of business continuity plans in the events of crisis have to be significant, and both the regulators, certainly in the US and in Asia, take that enormously seriously, and significant amounts of money are being invested. So I think this is to find more tools to support anti-terrorism as one element of that system attack is certainly something that I think all companies will be interested in. But it's to say that there is great sophistication and investment in this area already.
Well, there was a question regarding, as I understood it, on regulation and kind of the vulnerabilities that can be set up kind of off the radar, where many firms, for instance, aren't required to report on a worldwide consolidated basis their liabilities. And here it's very important to have a fuller picture of what's happening. One of the things that we advise governments in Latin America is how we see a lot of companies that through their offshore branches are issuing bonds in bigger volumes. And all of these can become a problem, not when you have this pro-cyclical kind of situation, but rather when there is a crisis, and in the pro-cyclical nature of funds can create latent vulnerabilities, especially when there is a reduced number of those funds that are managing those assets in the financial system or economy. So I think this is why, going back to something the Prime Minister mentioned, is the nature of how, and Mark mentioned it as well, you need to have a bigger coordination on regulatory issues. And even though countries and situations in economies are different, this kind of homogenization, and at least a way to have a bigger conversation of that, is really what's going to be bring trust around, and is going to be able to deal with some of these issues of shadow banking and others, which, as Chairman Wang was mentioning, these, in my view, are some of the key elements of bringing back trust.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience? Well, first of all, we'd like to go to the woman who missed out last time. Thank you. Please stand up, madam. Thank you.
谢谢。我的名字叫刘辉，来自广东省的一个民营企业。我想问各位嘉宾的一个问题就是，互联网金融对现有银行业或者金融业格局的影响。谢谢。谢谢。
Thank you for that question. Yes, the gentleman standing eagerly with his hand up down there.
Thank you. Richard Frank from Darby and Franklin Templeton Investments. My question to the panel is, after hearing yesterday that the APEC, Asian APEC economies will need $8 trillion of infrastructure investing, Latin America will probably need $2 to $3 trillion. What is the panel's view on the ability of the system to handle in terms of trust, regulation, and risk management for that flow of capital investment?
Thank you for that question. Are there other questioners? Thank you. The gentleman standing in the middle there.
谢谢。尊敬的主持人，尊敬的嘉宾，上午好。我是来自 APEC 中国理事单位天津华北集团的代表。今天我们华北集团的董事长、APEC 中国理事会的理事周文启先生也在现场。我在这里呢，想请教几个问题。第一呢，我想请教一下我们新西兰总理。那么，在目前的这种金融状况下，作为民营银行，在未来的亚太经济区域内的未来趋势是如何的？因为呢，我们天津华北集团是中国获得首批民营银行牌照的5家银行之一的第一大股东，所以我们对这个问题呢是非常的关注的。另外呢，我想请教一下美洲开发银行的行长，我想请问您一下，那么作为美洲地区的这种社区银行的模式，在中国是不是适宜发挥和开展？同时呢，我也想请教一下友邦集团的总裁先生，那么作为投资管理项目在中国的民营模式这个方向上，我们有哪些区域是可以我们在筹备阶段开始介入的？同时呢，我也想请教一下我们的洪章董事长，那么在中国的民营银行的启动阶段，我们对于剩余风险是如何把控的？作为中国的民营银行，它的恢复与处置计划所应该有的范畴是什么样的？好，谢谢。
Thank you, and we'll take one more question. Are there any more questions? Thank you, sir. You've got your hand up back there.
好。
Sorry, madam.
主持人，我有个问题。
No, the lady with her put her hand up first. Now standing. No, behind there.
好，主持人。
That's right. Thank you.
Hi, I'm the delegate from the Voice of Future 的 program. 我有一个问题想问一下王行长。我的问题是，上海自贸区的成立，您是如何看待它对于香港这个地位的冲击和影响？谢谢。
Well, thank you to the audience for your questions. We'll go back to the panel now, and I'll ask panelists to pick up on any questions they wish to. We can't necessarily cover everything, but also to make any concluding remarks about any insights they might have had that they'd like to pass on. Again, I'll start with Prime Minister Key. Thank you.
Alan, thanks very much. Let me start with the issue around investment and infrastructure. So I think Richard mentioned there's $8 trillion in the region, $2 trillion in Latin America. I mean, I think the simple answer is that that is going to be an area of enormous growth over the course of the next decade, because as countries, seek to get wealthier, as they industrialise, as they move up the value curve, then we are going to see enormous demand for infrastructure. It's not going to be possible to fund all of that at one time. That's the reality of huge demand and limited capacity. But I think you are going to see a lot of infrastructure developed. I think it's partly why China is pushing hard for the new investment and infrastructure fund that it's creating, or bank that it's trying to champion or has championed, because they can see that across the region there's huge demand in that area. And I think what we have seen in New Zealand is, as as the country's grown and become wealthier, the demand for that infrastructure ironically accelerates. It doesn't go the other way. And it in itself feeds higher levels of non-inflationary economic growth. So whether that's in the area of internet connectivity and or as basic as stabilising and developing your electricity networks or your roading and networks, your water networks, all of those things require a huge amount of investment. I think actually they're going to provide a big source, and they already do, of private sector investment. Mark pointed out that in the insurance industry, there's a very long-term liability there for their their holders. But in reality, actually, one of the great things about infrastructure is it provides a very long-term and very stable return potentially. So in New Zealand, what we've increasingly started to do is move away from Crown financing all of these investments and moving rapidly into trying to see where private sector can marry up through everything from public-private partnerships to the likes. I think the only other sort of comment I'd make, I think, is that increasingly what you're seeing around the room here is hardly surprising, is that you've got a lot of small to medium entrepreneurial, in this case Chinese businesses, but just generally businesses in the region that are looking to grow and expand. And the one thing that we know is as these businesses move out of their domestic market to operate in the region, those challenges grow exponentially, as do the opportunities. And so that really comes back to the fundamental reason why I think APEC's got such an important role. If you're a country like China, actually your domestic market is enormous, and maybe those opportunities are big enough to explore just within your national boundaries. But if you take a country like New Zealand, we're 4.5 million people, and as I'm fond of saying in New Zealand, we're never going to get rich selling things to 4.5 million New Zealanders. We've got at least a half-fighting chance of getting richer if we sell things to 4.5 billion people. And so, but as you move outside those boundaries, then obviously you bring into play all sorts of different rules, from sort of legal rules, accounting rules, financing opportunities. And I think the challenge for us is to allow those borders to evaporate for the wider region to open up and for us to explore those opportunities. The question I think around the financial sector though is how do we do that in such a way as we exploit the opportunities but don't expose the vulnerabilities? Because I still think ultimately leverage in that system presents quite a lot of risk actually. And if anything, if you go back to the I think 97, 98 Asian financial crisis, in a lot of ways that did two things. One, it exposed the real frailty of the system, and we saw significant damage, but ultimately it protected Asia when the global financial crisis came along because their systems were strengthened. And so the challenge for us is to make sure we have fundamentally good rules, but we're adaptive to the changing environment that we're in. I think we can do that, then I think those opportunities are there. And as Mark, I think, pointed out, one of the risks is that we over-regulate, believing actually that we're going to control the system and control those risks, when in reality we might just be forcing that risk to a far less regulated part of the economy, and ultimately creating a significant risk that we can't actually see or measure at the moment. So that's the opportunity for us, I think.
Thank you very much. President Moreno.
Well, quickly, and just building on what the Prime Minister said to Richard's question, I think one of the biggest challenges for infrastructure investment is to begin to identify and how to price the different risks. And increasingly, of course, these huge gaps of infrastructure can only be filled to a large degree in public-private partnerships. So the kind of construction risk, the kind of environmental risk, the need to have long-term financing, ideally in local currency, all of these risks combined, if they are priced adequately, if the project sponsors understand them, you will see more flows. On the contrary, if there is not sufficient understanding of those risks, they will be priced out and it will be hard to finance. But without a doubt, certainly, as Richard was saying, from the perspective of Latin America, this is going to be a 25-year kind of need where we need to double up on our infrastructure investment, and that will lead to more competitiveness and to more productivity. And this issue, of course, of infrastructure is now not exclusive to emerging markets. I think it's world over. And I know that's very much a theme that will be discussed later this week in the margins of the G20. In terms of the question around I think the question was social banks. I take it that the meaning here was the kinds of things that are done in microfinance. Here we have, being China a shareholder of the IDB, we've done a lot of exchanges with the PBOC and others to kind of bring to China some of the experiences that we've had in Latin America with microfinance, which are actually very good ones. But still there is a huge demand for microfinance throughout Latin America in general. And I think certainly we have a system by which if Chinese companies want to do investments in Latin America, we can finance either those investments, and we do this through lines of credit, the things that we even do with the China Construction Bank or Trade Finance and others.
Thank you for that. Mr. Tucker.
Thanks, Alan. Just, I think, just in taking into account time, I think that just to deal perhaps with internet finance and a specific question on insurance. Certainly on the internet finance side, I think managing and regulating internet finance, particularly on the insurance side, developments there have been very strong on the property and casualty side on the basis of a commoditized product, and the businesses that have been built, the engines that have been built for that, I think are increasingly sophisticated. On the life insurance side, it's been more problematic. It's not a commoditized industry. Everybody's personal circumstances, wealth, financial needs, tax circumstances are different, and therefore the ability to work that through the internet finance route to this stage has not been on the sales side, have not been significant. Clearly using it to service customers, this has been a major development for insurance companies, for life companies for many, many years. In terms of learning from lessons from other parts of Asia, I think lessons to be learned from everywhere, but I think the most powerful lesson is that one size does not fit all, and that looking at regulation, looking at the appropriate stage of development of the country, looking at the sophistication of the tax, accounting, regulatory systems, looking at the sophistication of individuals, all of these are different dimensions, and therefore I think it is looking, generally there's a direction of travel, but the focus I think should be on looking what is appropriate and what is proportionate.
Thank you. And to conclude, Chairman Wang.
互联网对银行业有哪些影响？那么我需要说明的是，不是说互联网对银行业有哪些影响，而是互联网金融对传统银行有哪些影响？过去呢
Excuse me, Chairman Wang, microphone.
Sorry.
Thank you.
刚才有个嘉宾讲到的是互联网金融对银行业有哪些影响？那么我需要说明的是，不是说互联网金融对银行业有哪些影响，而是说互联网金融对传统的银行业有哪些影响？这可能更为准确。过去曾经有流传的一句话，要改变银行，互联网金融。那么我需要说明的是，银行业现在已经开始改变，而且改变的步伐还是比较快的。互联网金融对传统的银行业确实是个挑战。大家都知道，现在到处都是银行业的网点。过去有句话，国内有句话说，银行比中国的厕所还要多。那么今后随着这个互联网技术的发展，这银行业的网点可能更多的要通过互联网的技术来进行支付、进行产品的网上销售，以及为客户的服务。互联网的技术是非常发达的，而且是交易便捷，这个交易的范围也非常广，成本也非常低。那么现在社会上的一些互联网技术， 对传统的银行业因为发生了一些根本性的改变。现在银行业的互联网技术最近几年也得到了突飞猛进的发展，各个商业银行、大的商业银行都有自己的互联网的产品、互联网的工具和互联网的系统来为客户服务。现在网上交易的产品、交易的包括使用的工具，以及为客户服务的手段，已经占了传统银行的，刚才讲到关于电子的交易就占80%以上。那么互联网金融呢？我们这个客户使用互联网，无论是对公客户还是对视客户，使用互联网技术呢，都在50%以上。当然，银行和社会上的互联网金融企业，那么最大的不同点，我们关注的最主要的风险。所以大家也感觉到，说是社会上的电商平台、互联网的 P2P， 包括其他的互联网金融技术，比银行的方便快捷，而且是这个使用范围非常广。我赞成这样一种评价。但是银行的互联网技术，无论从它的经营模式的设计，以及它的风险控制的手段，以及它为客户服务的综合化服务的水平，我想可能不亚于社会上的其他的互联网金融组织。所以我也希望社会上的其他的互联网金融组织和银行业的互联网为客户提供的这些技术，大家相辅相成。共同的为客户提供良好的服务。所以呢，这里面不是谁改变谁，而是大家都在改变。那么刚才也有那个嘉宾问到了这个民营企业，因为我不是民营企业的董事长，所以民营企业的风险控制，应该民营企业的董事长应该把它作为民营银行董事长在他进入市场的时候，首先考虑的，我希望他不要只考虑我市场的范围我做多少，客户我要接纳多少，我要营销多少，首先要考虑风险。中国有句话叫“金融有风险，入市需谨慎”。第二个呢，这个中国民营银行的发展，可能对中国的金融业的改革，对中国金融机构的更加健全，能够提高的为客户服务的覆盖度，有着正面的作用。另外，民营银行的机制也非常灵活，我们大银行也希望在民营银行的经营过程当中取得经验，我们大银行也可以向这些民营银行来学习。谢
谢。Thank you, Chairman Wang. Well, in my role as Director of the APEC Secretariat, I've had the opportunity to sit through, over the last couple of days, quite intense meetings from the trade ministers and the foreign ministers of the APEC economies. It's been a very busy year that China's hosted. There's 3 very big things that are coming out of it, and they all have implications for this global financial sector. One of them is free trade area for Asia and the Pacific, possibility of a study looking at where we go long term on that. It does have big requirements for how APEC financial systems and banking are going to work. Another has been connectivity blueprint and where infrastructure is going to go in this region. We've heard more about that. And yes, we need funding, but we don't just need funding, we need other things to work as well for that. And finally, there's been a lot of discussion on what are the new growth drivers for the whole region. And again, how are we going to mobilise the savings that are in this region and intermediate them as efficiently as possible? Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard about a number of these issues from this panel. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panellists, President Moreno, Prime Minister Key, Chief Executive Tucker, Chairman Wang. Thank you very much.